The alarm on my phone went off at exactly 5:79 a.m., not 5:15 or 5:20, 5:17. It was one of my many quirks that made perfect sense to me and seemed absurd to everyone else, like my insistence on using Hungarian notation in my variable names or my refusal to update my IDE theme from the factory default. These weren't hills I was willing to die on. They were just the comfortable grooves I'd worn into my life after 2 decades of professional coding. Who hard codes a date formatter into a dynamic pricing engine? That's what I thought as Brandon, the CEO's 26-year-old product visionary with a finance degree and 5 TikTok side hustles, called my code outdated. They gave him the product stack like a new Tesla, sleek, dangerous, and totally untested. I was just the fossil keeping the engine from exploding. When he called my work prehistoric, I didn't argue. I just made sure my terminal was clean and my backups lived far, far away. I'm Helen Briggs, 42, Senior Systems Architect at Finuvara Systems in Chicago. Or at least, that was who I was until 3 weeks ago. Now I'm just Helen, sitting in my apartment with a mug of coffee gone cold, watching the tech news and waiting for the inevitable. The first thing you need to understand about legacy code is that it's not just old. Legacy code is battle-scarred. It's been through the wars. It's survived 1,000 requirements changes, emergency patches at 3 a.m., and the collective wisdom and folly of every developer who's touched it. Brandon Wells didn't understand that. To him, legacy meant outdated, and outdated meant worthless. I still remember the day he arrived. Frank Wells, our CEO and Brandon's father, paraded him through the office like he was presenting the crown prince. "Everyone, I'd like you to meet Brandon, our new head of product. He's just finished his MBA at Lakeside West Business School, and he's got some exciting ideas to bring Finuvara into the future." Brandon wore a blue button-down with the sleeves rolled up just so, revealing the edge of a minimalist tattoo. His hair was perfectly styled in that "I woke up like this but actually spent 30 minutes on it" way. He smiled with teeth so white they should have come with a warning label, and shook hands like someone who'd practiced the perfect grip in a business communication seminar. "I'm so pumped to be working with all of you," he said, with practiced enthusiasm. "I've been studying SaaS architectures and cloud-native implementations, and I think we have a massive opportunity to leapfrog our competition by modernizing our stack." The engineers exchanged glances. We'd heard this song before. Every few years, some new manager would arrive with grand plans to rewrite everything, only to discover that our outdated systems processed millions of financial transactions daily without breaking a sweat. But this time was different. This wasn't just any manager, this was the boss's son. Frank clapped his hand on Brandon's shoulder, beaming with pride. "Brandon's going to lead our product transformation initiative. I want everyone to give him their full support." I caught Raj's eye across the room. Raj had been at Finuvara almost as long as I had. He raised an eyebrow slightly, and I knew we were thinking the same thing. Here we go again. After the introduction, Brandon made a beeline for my desk. I was the obvious target, the architect behind most of our core systems. "Helen, right? Dad's told me all about you, the wizard who keeps the engines running." His smile was friendly, but there was something calculating in his eyes. "That's me. Less wizard, more mechanic. Though." I gestured to my screen, where I was debugging an issue with our Israeli vendor date formatting. Just keeping the gears turning. That's exactly what I wanted to talk about. I've been looking at our architecture diagrams, and I think we need to make some bold moves. Everything is so tightly coupled. We need to break these monoliths apart, move to microservices, implement CI/CD pipelines. He spoke with the confidence of someone who'd read all the right Medium articles but had never had to wake up at 2 a.m. because a production system crashed. I nodded politely, knowing this conversation wasn't really about seeking my input. "I'd love to get your thoughts on a transition plan. Maybe we could grab coffee later this week," he continued. "Sure," I said, not meaning it. "Just ping me when you're free." As he walked away, I turned back to my code. The Israeli date formatter issue was tricky. Their fiscal system required dates in a specific format that didn't align with any standard libraries. Years ago, I'd written a custom formatter to handle it. It wasn't elegant, but it worked, and our Israeli clients had never had a problem. I couldn't have known then that this little piece of inelegant code would become the first casualty in Brandon's war on legacy. The changes started small. First, I noticed I'd been removed from several sprint planning boards. When I asked about it, I was told it was an oversight that would be fixed. It wasn't. Then my code reviews started getting rejected with comments like, "Let's implement this in a more modern way," or "This approach isn't scalable." Code that had been scaling just fine for years suddenly wasn't good enough. Documents I'd written about system architecture mysteriously disappeared from our wiki, replaced with glossy new diagrams that emphasized buzzwords over functionality. When I pointed out critical components that were missing in the new plans, I was told they were implementation details that would be addressed later. The real trouble began when Brandon announced his first major initiative, Project Phoenix, a complete rewrite of our core pricing engine. The pricing engine was my baby. I'd architected it from the ground up, carefully building in all the edge cases and special requirements that our global customer base needed. The current system is too complex, Brandon explained during the kickoff meeting. We need something clean, modern, and cloud-native. We'll implement a new pricing engine based on microservices architecture, with each component handling a specific part of the calculation pipeline. It sounded good in theory. In practice, it ignored the reality of our business. Our pricing wasn't just about calculating numbers, it was about handling the complex relationships between different financial systems across the globe. We had custom code for tax calculations in Brazil, dual rate processing for certain currencies, and yes, that hard-coded date formatter for our Israeli vendors. I raised my hand. Brandon, I think we need to be careful about how we approach this. There are a lot of special cases in the current system that exist for good reasons. Brandon's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened slightly. I appreciate your concern, Helen, but that's exactly the problem. We've accumulated too many special cases and hacks. We need to clean house and build something maintainable. These aren't hacks, I said, trying to keep my voice level. They're necessary accommodations for the realities of global finance. I think we can find more elegant solutions, he replied dismissively. The team and I will review all the requirements and make sure everything important is captured in the new design. After the meeting, Raj caught up with me in the hallway. That went well, he said dryly. I sighed. He doesn't understand what he's dealing with. No, but he's the boss's son. So what can we do? Raj shrugged. Maybe the new system will actually be better. Maybe, I said, not believing it for a second. Over the next few weeks, I tried to stay involved in Project Phoenix, documenting the critical features that needed to be preserved and offering insights into why certain parts of the system worked the way they did. Most of my emails went unanswered. When I managed to corner Brandon in person, he would listen politely before explaining that they were taking a fresh approach that wouldn't be constrained by legacy thinking. Legacy thinking. That's what my experience had become in his eyes. A liability rather than an asset. The situation came to a head during an all-hands meeting 3 months after Brandon's arrival. Frank was traveling, so Brandon took the stage alone, dressed in a black turtleneck that made him look like a tech CEO cosplayer. I'm excited to announce that Project Phoenix is ahead of schedule, he began, clicking through slides that showed sleek, simplified diagrams of the new system. We've made the bold decision to completely reimagine our core architecture, free from the constraints of legacy code. I felt a knot form in my stomach. This wasn't just about replacing systems anymore, it was about erasing history, my history. As part of this transition, Brandon continued, we'll be sunsetting all legacy components within the next 60 days. Our new cloud-native platform will provide all the functionality our customers need, with better performance and scalability. Raj leaned over to whisper, did they actually build in all the special cases? I shook my head slightly. I'd seen enough of the new codebase to know they hadn't even scratched the surface of the complexity our old system handled. After the presentation, I approached Brandon. We need to talk about this timeline. There are critical features in the legacy system that haven't been implemented in Phoenix. Brandon's smile was practiced and perfect. Helen, I understand you're attached to the old system. It's natural to feel protective of code you've written. But we've done a thorough analysis, and we're confident that Phoenix covers all the essential functionality. It doesn't, I insisted. What about the Israeli date formatter, the Brazil tax calculator, the dual rate processing for UAE transactions? Those are all edge cases that we're handling in a more elegant way now. Trust me, we've got this covered. I took a deep breath. Brandon, these aren't edge cases. They're core business requirements. If you launch without them, we're going to have serious problems. His expression hardened. I think you're overestimating the complexity. Our new system is designed to be flexible and adaptable. We can handle any special cases as they arise. That's not how financial software works, I said, my frustration mounting. You can't just fix things on the fly when you're dealing with people's money. I appreciate your concern, he said, in a tone that made it clear he didn't. But the decision has been made. Phoenix launches in 60 days. I spent the next week documenting everything I could about the critical features that were being overlooked. I compiled a detailed report and sent it to Brandon, Frank, and the rest of the leadership team. Frank was still traveling, and Brandon responded with a brief note thanking me for my historical perspective, but assuring me that everything was under control. The following Monday, I arrived at work to find my access badge didn't work. When I called the front desk, I was directed to a conference room where HR was waiting. Helen, we've decided to go in a different direction with our technical leadership, the HR director said, not quite meeting my eyes. As the company moves toward a more modern architecture, we need leaders who are aligned with that vision. I was being fired. After 15 years at Finovara, I was being shown the door because I wouldn't cheerfully participate in what I knew was a disaster in the making. There was no acknowledgement of my contributions, no thanks for the systems I'd built that had made the company millions. Just a severance package and instructions to hand over my laptop. As I packed up my desk, Raj came by. This is bullshit, he said quietly. Everyone knows it. But no one's going to say anything, I replied. He looked away. We've all got mortgages, Helen. I couldn't blame him. I'd have probably done the same in his position. Just be ready for when it all falls apart, I said. That bad? Worse. I closed my box of personal items. They didn't implement any of the international handling, none of it. Raj winced. Jesus, that's nearly 30% of our revenue. I know. I picked up my box. Good luck, Raj. You're going to need it. As I walked out of Finovara Systems for the last time, I felt a strange mix of anger, relief, and anticipation. I knew what was coming. It was just a matter of time. I spent the next 3 weeks in a strange limbo. I updated my resume, but didn't submit it anywhere. I worked on some personal coding projects. I caught up on sleep, and I waited for the inevitable phone call. It came 24 days after I'd been fired. Phoenix had launched a week earlier, to great fanfare. Brandon had been quoted in several tech publications talking about how Finovara had shed its legacy constraints and embraced a truly modern architecture. The problem started small. A few customers in Japan reported that their invoices were showing incorrect amounts. Then clients in the UAE noticed that their transactions were being processed at the wrong exchange rate. By the end of the week, the entire Brazilian customer base was threatening to leave because the system was calculating their taxes incorrectly. The tech press, which had been so enthusiastic about Phoenix a week earlier, now ran stories with headlines like, Finovara's modern architecture modernly fails international customers, and Phoenix crashes and burns, a lesson in respecting legacy code. When my phone rang, I wasn't surprised to see Frank Wells's name on the caller ID. Helen, he said, sounding exhausted. We need your help. I'm listening, I replied, keeping my voice neutral. The new system. It's not working the way we expected. We're having issues with international transactions, date formatting, all sorts of things. Brandon says they just need time to work out the kinks, but we're losing customers every day. These aren't kinks, Frank. They're fundamental requirements that were ignored. There was a long pause. I know. That's why I'm calling. We need you to come back and fix this. As an employee, as a consultant, name your price. I'd had 3 weeks to think about what I would ask for if this call came. I'll help, but I have conditions. First, I want ownership of the intellectual property for any code I write to fix this. Second, I want complete access to the system, no oversight, no approvals needed. Third, I want a public acknowledgement that the problems were caused by ignoring established requirements, not by kinks in the new system. Frank hesitated. The IP would have to be licensed to us exclusively. That's fine, but I own it. And the public acknowledgement. Can we word it diplomatically? You can say that critical business logic from the legacy system was not fully implemented in the initial release. That's diplomatic enough. Another pause? All right. When can you start? I'll be there tomorrow morning. Have someone ready to give me full system access as soon as I arrive. The next day, I walked back into Finovara with a different kind of badge, a consultant's pass that gave me access to everything. The atmosphere in the office was tense. Engineers huddled around monitors, looking stressed. The customer service team was on the phones constantly, trying to placate angry clients. Brandon was notably absent. When I asked, Raj told me he'd been temporarily reassigned while the crisis was being resolved. I spent the first day just assessing the damage. The new system was actually well designed in many ways, clean, modular, easy to understand, but it was built with a profound ignorance of the complexities of global finance. It assumed a uniformity that simply didn't exist in the real world. On the second day, I began to rebuild the missing components. I started with the Adjust Global Currency function, which handled all the special cases for currency conversion. In the old system, this function was nearly 600 lines long and contained dozens of special cases. In Phoenix, it had been reduced to a simple API call to a standard exchange rate service. I gathered the development team and walked them through what I was doing, explaining each special case and why it existed. This block here, I said, pointing to a particularly complex section, handles transactions in Japanese yen when they're being processed through a UAE banking intermediary. The standard conversion would apply the wrong rate because of how the UAE Central Bank handles yen transactions after 3 p.m. Gulf Standard Time. The developers, many of whom were new and had never worked on the old system, looked incredulous. How would anyone even know that? One of them asked. Because we lost nearly $1 million figuring it out 5 years ago, I replied. That's why this code exists. It's not technical debt or a hack. It's institutional knowledge encoded as software. Day by day, I rebuilt the missing pieces of the system, the Israeli date formatter, the Brazilian tax calculator, the dual rate processor. Each one represented years of hard-won knowledge about how global finance actually worked, not how it was supposed to work in textbooks or MBA programs. As I worked, I documented everything extensively, explaining not just how the code worked, but why it was necessary. I wanted to make sure that even after I left, this knowledge wouldn't be lost again. Frank checked in regularly, relieved as each problem was fixed and customers stopped threatening to leave. Brandon remained conspicuously absent. After 2 weeks of intensive work, the crisis was over. Phoenix was stable, processing transactions correctly for all our international customers. The emergency was over, but the damage to Finovara's reputation would take longer to repair. On my last day as a consultant, Frank called me into his office. Brandon was there, looking much less confident than he had a month earlier. Helen, I want to thank you for what you've done, Frank began. You saved the company, plain and simple. I nodded, waiting. We'd like to offer you a permanent position again. Chief Architect, reporting directly to me. Full creative control over the technical direction of our products. It was a good offer, better than my previous position. But I'd spent the last month remembering what it felt like to be valued for my knowledge, not just tolerated until something newer and shinier came along. I appreciate the offer, Frank, but I've decided to start my own consulting firm. Ghost Ops Consulting. We specialize in rescuing projects that have discarded institutional knowledge in the name of modernization. Frank looked disappointed, but not surprised. I understand. Would GoStops be open to a retainer arrangement with Finovara? Monthly code audits, architecture reviews, that sort of thing? We would, I said. At our standard rates? Of course. Of course, Frank agreed. Brandon cleared his throat. Helen, I want to apologize. I was arrogant. I didn't respect the knowledge embedded in the systems you built. I looked at him, seeing not just the boss's son now, but a young developer who had learned a painful lesson. Don't thank me, I said. Just don't ever call good code cute again. He had the grace to look embarrassed at that. He'd once dismissed one of my most elegant solutions as cute little workarounds. As I left Finovara for the second time, I felt none of the anger or anticipation I'd felt before. Instead, I felt a sense of closure and vindication. The systems I'd built had proven their worth not through arguments or presentations, but through their absence. 6 months later, GoStops Consulting was thriving. We had clients across the financial sector, all of them companies that had learned the hard way that legacy wasn't a dirty word. Finovara remained our biggest client, with monthly audits that Brandon, now relegated to special product liaison with no commit privileges, was required to attend. The tech industry continues its love affair with the new and shiny, discarding the old without understanding its value. But some of us know better. Legacy isn't old code, it's survival logic dressed in scars. And sometimes you don't appreciate those scars until you've bled a little yourself. One night, I found myself working late, fixing a particularly thorny currency conversion issue for a new client. As I typed, I realized I was using Hungarian notation for my variable names, and I smiled to myself. Some habits never change. My alarm would still go off at exactly 5:17 the next morning, and I'd still be using the default IDE theme. These weren't flaws or outdated practices. They were the comfortable grooves I'd worn into my professional life, my own personal legacy code. And like all good legacy code, they had survived because they worked. In the end, that's what matters. Not whether your code is trendy or your architecture follows the latest pattern. What matters is whether. When everything is on the line and millions of dollars are at stake, your systems do what they're supposed to do. Brandon never understood that, but he's learning. The rest of us? We've known it all along. Legacy isn't old code, it's survival logic dressed in scars. The morning after I was fired from Finovara, I sat in my apartment staring at the ceiling fan, watching it spin in perfect, predictable circles. 15 years of my life had gone into that company. 15 years of late nights, emergency patches, and carefully crafted solutions to seemingly impossible problems. All of it dismissed as legacy junk by a kid who thought he knew better. My phone buzzed with messages from former colleagues, expressions of outrage, promises to stay in touch, offers to help me find a new position. I appreciated the sentiment, but I knew how these things went. The outrage would fade, the messages would slow. Everyone would adapt to the new reality at Finovara, and I'd become a cautionary tale. Remember what happened to Helen when she wouldn't get on board with Phoenix? I spent that first week in a strange limbo. I updated my LinkedIn profile but didn't reach out to recruiters. I cleaned my apartment, went for long walks along Lake Michigan, and slept more than I had in years. Part of me was enjoying the break. Another part was waiting, watching, knowing that the clock was ticking on Brandon's shiny new system. The problems would start with the international transactions. I was certain of it. Phoenix had been designed with a fundamental misunderstanding of how global finance worked. It assumed a uniformity and standardization that simply didn't exist in the real world. Financial systems in different countries had evolved independently, shaped by local regulations, cultural practices, and historical quirks. My legacy code had accommodated all of those differences, not because I was a coding genius, but because I'd learned about them one painful incident at a time. I remembered the first time we'd run into issues with the Israeli date formatting. A client had called, furious because their fiscal year closing was showing incorrectly in our system. It had taken 3 days of investigation to discover that their system required dates in a specific format that didn't match any standard library. I'd written a custom formatter to handle it, and we'd never had an issue again, until now. Or the Brazilian tax calculations. Brazil's tax system was notoriously complex, with different rates applying depending on the type of transaction, the entities involved, and even the time of year. Our legacy code had a dedicated module just for handling these calculations, built over years of collaboration with our Brazilian clients and tax experts. And then there was the dual rate processing for transactions involving certain Middle Eastern countries. Due to how their central banks handled foreign exchanges, the standard conversion rates could be wildly inaccurate at certain times of day. We'd lost nearly $1 million learning that lesson before implementing a solution that checked multiple sources and applied the correct rate based on a complex set of criteria. None of these solutions were elegant in the way that Brandon and his team valued elegance. They weren't clean, simple, or easy to understand at a glance. They were complex because the problems they solved were complex. They were battle-tested, reliable, and, most importantly, they worked. Phoenix had none of that. It was built on the assumption that a clean, modern architecture could somehow simplify the messy realities of global finance. It was a beautiful system designed for a world that didn't exist. As the days passed, I found myself checking the tech news more frequently, looking for signs of trouble at Finovara. 2 weeks after my departure, I noticed they'd delayed the Phoenix launch by a week, citing final integration testing. I smiled grimly. Integration testing was exactly where they'd discover the problems I'd been warning about, if they were actually testing with real-world data. Which I doubted. The launch finally happened 3 weeks after I'd been fired. Finovara issued a press release celebrating their revolutionary cloud-native financial platform that would set new standards for the industry. Brandon was quoted extensively, talking about how they'd shed the constraints of legacy systems to build something truly modern and scalable. The problem started almost immediately. A colleague still at Finovara texted me 2 days after the launch. Japanese clients reporting incorrect invoices. Brandon says it's just a UI issue. It's not. I knew what had happened without even seeing the code. Phoenix was probably using a standard currency conversion API that didn't account for the special handling needed for yen transactions. Depending on the time of day and the specific banks involved, the error could be as high as 3–4%. Not a UI issue at all, but a fundamental misunderstanding of how these transactions worked. 3 days later, the same colleague texted again. UAE clients threatening to leave, exchange rates all wrong, emergency meetings all day. The dual rate processing issue, I'd warned them specifically about this one. Transactions involving UAE banks sometimes needed to be processed using different exchange rates depending on the time of day and the currency involved. Our legacy system had handled this automatically. Phoenix, with its clean architecture, almost certainly didn't. A week after launch, the tech blogs that had been so enthusiastic about Phoenix began publishing less flattering articles. Finovara's Phoenix falters, international clients report widespread issues. Cloud native doesn't mean business ready. Lessons from Finovara's troubled launch. Is modernization always the answer? Finovara's struggle raises questions. I didn't feel the satisfaction I'd expected. These weren't just technical issues, they were affecting real people and businesses who relied on Finovara's systems. Clients who couldn't process transactions correctly might be unable to pay their own vendors or employees. The ripple effects could be serious. When Frank Wells finally called, 24 days after firing me, I was ready. I'd spent the time thinking about what I wanted and what Finovara needed. I wasn't interested in gloating or revenge. I wanted to fix the problems and ensure they wouldn't happen again. But on my terms. The negotiation was brief. Frank was desperate and I was calm. I would help as a consultant, not an employee. I would own the intellectual property for any code I wrote, licensing it back to Finovara. I would have complete access and autonomy. And there would be a public acknowledgement that the problems stemmed from ignoring established requirements, not from unforeseen kinks in the new system. Frank agreed to everything. By the time I hung up, I had already started mentally mapping out what needed to be done. The core issues would be in the currency handling and international transaction processing. I'd need to rebuild the special case handlers that Phoenix had discarded, but integrate them in a way that fit with the new architecture. Walking back into Finovara the next morning was surreal. The receptionist did a double take when I gave my name. People stared as I made my way through the office, some looking guilty, others relieved. Raj met me at the elevator, relief evident on his face. "Thank God you're back," he said, lowering his voice. "It's been chaos. We've got clients threatening to sue, revenue projections in free fall, and no one seems to know how to fix it." "Where's Brandon?" I asked. Noticing his office door was closed, Raj grimaced. "Temporarily reassigned to strategic initiatives. Frank's put him on ice while we sort this out." "And the Phoenix team?" "In the conference room, waiting for you. They've been trying to patch the international transaction issues for a week with no luck." I nodded. "Let's not keep them waiting." The conference room fell silent when I walked in. The Phoenix team, mostly young developers hired after Brandon arrived, looked stressed and exhausted. Many of them had probably been working around the clock trying to fix problems they didn't fully understand. "I'm Helen Briggs," I said, setting down my laptop. "I'm here to help get Phoenix back on track. I'll need complete access to the codebase and a thorough briefing on all the issues you're currently experiencing." One of the developers, a young woman with purple-streaked hair, spoke up. "I'm Amy, tech lead for Phoenix. We've been having issues with international transactions, especially in Japan, UAE, and Brazil. We've tried implementing fixes based on the documentation, but nothing seems to work consistently." "The documentation won't help you," I said, logging into the system with my new consultant credentials. Most of the special cases weren't documented because they evolved organically over years. The knowledge was embedded in the code itself. "Then how are we supposed to fix it?" another developer asked, frustration evident in his voice. "That's why I'm here." I pulled up the Phoenix codebase and began navigating through it. "First, I need to understand how you've architected the currency and transaction handling." For the next hour, Amy walked me through the Phoenix architecture. It was clean, modular, and well-organized, a testament to solid engineering practices. But, as I suspected, it was built on fundamentally flawed assumptions about how global finance worked. "Your currency conversion is using a single API call to a standard exchange rate service," I noted. "That's going to fail for at least a dozen special cases." "But it's following the ISO standards," Amy protested. "It should work for any currency pair." "Should, but doesn't," I replied. "Financial systems aren't built on should. They're built on what actually happens in practice. And in practice, there are exceptions to every rule." I opened a new file and began coding the adjust global currency function that would replace their simplistic conversion method. As I worked, I explained each special case and why it existed. "This block handles yen transactions through UAE banks," I said, coding rapidly. "The standard conversion would apply the wrong rate because of how their central bank processes foreign currencies after certain hours." "How would anyone even know that?" one of the younger developers asked. "We lost a lot of money figuring it out," I replied. "That's the point. This code represents expensive lessons that the company has already paid for once. You don't want to pay for them again." Over the next few days, I rebuilt the critical components that Phoenix had discarded: the Israeli date formatter, the Brazilian tax calculator, the dual rate processor. Each one represented knowledge that had been earned through years of experience and sometimes costly mistakes. As I worked, I made sure to document everything extensively, not just how the code worked, but why it was necessary. I organized knowledge-sharing sessions with the Phoenix team, walking them through the business reasons behind each special case. Gradually, the emergency eased. Japanese invoices began showing correct amounts. UAE transactions processed at the right exchange rates. Brazilian clients reported that their tax calculations were finally accurate. The immediate crisis was passing, but the damage to Finovara's reputation would take longer to repair. Throughout this time, Brandon remained absent. Frank checked in regularly, clearly relieved as each problem was fixed and fewer clients threatened to leave. The Phoenix team, initially defensive, became increasingly collaborative as they realized I wasn't there to criticize their work but to fill in the gaps in their understanding. After 2 weeks of intensive work, we reached a stable state. Phoenix was processing transactions correctly for all international clients. The emergency was over. I called a final meeting with the development team to hand over the completed work. The system is stable now, I told them. But it's important to understand why these issues happened in the first place. Phoenix was built with a fundamental misunderstanding of the problem domain. You designed for an idealized version of global finance, not the messy reality. Amy nodded. We thought we were simplifying things, making them cleaner and more maintainable. We didn't realize all those special cases were actually essential business logic. That's the paradox of legacy code, I said. It looks messy because the problems it solves are messy. The complexity isn't arbitrary. It's necessary complexity that reflects the real world. So what do we do going forward? Another developer asked. How do we avoid making the same mistake again? Document the why, not just the how, I advised. Make sure everyone understands that these special cases aren't technical debt to be eliminated, they're institutional knowledge to be preserved. And before you replace any system, make sure you truly understand what it does and why it does it that way. After the meeting, Frank called me into his office. Brandon was there, looking much less confident than he had a month earlier. Helen, I want to thank you for what you've done. Frank began. You saved the company, plain and simple. I nodded, waiting. We'd like to offer you a permanent position again. Chief Architect, reporting directly to me. Full creative control over the technical direction of our products. It was a good offer, better than my previous position. But during my time away from Finovara, I'd realized something important. There were probably dozens of companies out there making the same mistake, discarding valuable institutional knowledge in the name of modernization. And most of them wouldn't have someone like me to warn them before it was too late. I appreciate the offer, Frank. But I've decided to start my own consulting firm, I said. Ghost Ops Consulting. We specialize in rescuing projects that have discarded institutional knowledge in the name of modernization. Frank looked disappointed, but not surprised. I understand. Would Ghost Ops be open to a retainer arrangement with Finovara, monthly code audits, architecture reviews, that sort of thing? We would, I said. At our standard rates, of course. Of course. Frank agreed. Brandon cleared his throat. Helen, I want to apologize. I was arrogant. I didn't respect the knowledge embedded in the systems you built. I looked at him, seeing not just the boss's son now, but a young developer who had learned a painful lesson. Don't thank me, I said. Just don't ever call good code cute again. He had the grace to look embarrassed at that. He'd once dismissed one of my most elegant solutions as cute little workarounds. In the months that followed, Ghost Ops Consulting grew rapidly. We specialized in bridging the gap between legacy systems and modern architectures, preserving institutional knowledge while still allowing for technical evolution. Finovara remained our biggest client, with monthly audits that Brandon, now relegated to special product liaison with no commit privileges, was required to attend. One night, about 6 months after the Phoenix crisis, I found myself working late in my home office. I was reviewing code for a new client, another financial services company that had nearly made the same mistake Finovara had. They'd been on the verge of discarding a decade-old transaction processing system in favor of something sleeker and more modern. Fortunately, someone there had heard about what happened at Finovara and called me in for a consultation before they pulled the trigger. As I scrolled through their legacy codebase, I recognized the familiar patterns: special case handlers, carefully constructed workarounds for external systems quirks, accommodation for regulatory requirements that changed from country to country. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like a mess of technical debt. To me, it was a treasure trove of institutional knowledge. My phone buzzed with a text from Raj. You should see Brandon these days, follows the senior devs around like a puppy. asking questions about why things work the way they do. Complete 180 from before. I smiled. Perhaps there was hope for Brandon after all. The tech industry's obsession with newness and disruption had led to a dangerous devaluation of experience and history. But maybe, one painful lesson at a time. That was starting to change. The next morning, I had a meeting scheduled with the CTO of my new client. As I drove to their office, I thought about how to explain the value of what they almost threw away. It wasn't just about the code itself, it was about the knowledge embedded in it, the lessons learned over years of real-world operation. You couldn't capture that in documentation or training sessions. It lived in the system itself, in all its complex, sometimes inelegant glory. The CTO greeted me in the lobby, a woman about my age with salt and pepper hair and the weary eyes of someone who'd fought many technological battles. "I've been reviewing your legacy system," I said as we walked to the conference room. "There's a lot of valuable knowledge encoded in there." She nodded. "That's what I've been trying to tell the board, but they're enamored with the promise of a clean slate approach. Let me guess, a vendor came in and told them they could replace everything with a modern, cloud-native solution that would be cheaper to maintain and more scalable?" Exactly. Promised a 30% reduction in operating costs and a 50% improvement in performance. I laughed. "And did they mention how they were going to handle your custom tax calculations for Southeast Asian markets? Or the special currency handling for transactions that cross the EU-UK boundary post-Brexit?" She stopped walking and looked at me with surprise. "How did you know about those?" "I saw them in the code. They're exactly the kind of special cases that get overlooked in clean slate rewrites. The same thing happened at Finovara. But they didn't realize it until after they'd launched and started losing customers." The meeting went well. By the end, the CTO had ammunition to push back against the board's modernization fervor. We agreed on a more measured approach, identifying components that truly could benefit from modernization while preserving the critical business logic that had evolved over time. As I left, she shook my hand warmly. "You know, when I heard about what happened at Finovara, I thought it was just incompetence, but now I see it could have easily happened here too." "It happens everywhere," I replied. "We've created a tech culture that worships the new and dismisses the old without understanding its value. But the pendulum is starting to swing back, I think." Back in my car, I checked my calendar for my next appointment, a monthly audit at Finovara. These visits had become routine but were still important. Phoenix was stable now. But as the system evolved, there was always the risk of new changes inadvertently breaking the special case handling we'd rebuilt. When I arrived at Finovara, the atmosphere was noticeably different from those tense days after the Phoenix launch. People seemed focused, but not frantic. The emergency was long past, but the lessons remained. Brandon was waiting in the conference room when I arrived. These audit sessions were part of his rehabilitation process, Frank's way of ensuring he never made the same mistake again. "Hello, Helen," he said, less cocky than before but not quite chastened either. He'd found a new equilibrium somewhere in between. "I've got the change logs ready for review." We spent the next 2 hours going through all the modifications made to Phoenix since my last audit. Most were routine, bug fixes, performance improvements, minor feature additions. But one caught my attention, a proposed change to the Brazilian tax calculation module. "This looks like a simplification of the special case handling for São Paulo transactions," I noted. "What's the rationale?" Brandon hesitated. The development team thought the current implementation was overly complex. They identified what they believed were redundant checks and proposed streamlining them. I pulled up the code in question. "These checks aren't redundant. They're handling different regulatory requirements that happen to use similar calculation methods. Remove them. And you'll break compliance for certain types of financial institutions." That wasn't clear from the code or documentation, Brandon admitted, which is exactly why these audits are important. I made a note to update the documentation to explain the business reasons behind those checks. "This is a perfect example of what we've been discussing. The complexity exists for a reason, even if that reason isn't immediately obvious." After the audit concluded, Brandon walked me to the elevator. He seemed to have something on his mind. You know, I've been thinking a lot about what happened, he said finally. Not just the technical failures, but my approach to the whole project. And, I prompted, I was so focused on proving myself, on making a big splash, that I didn't take the time to understand what I was changing. I saw complexity and assumed it was bad, without asking why it was there in the first place. That's a common mistake, I acknowledged. The tech industry has trained us to equate simplicity with quality. But that's not always true. Sometimes complexity is necessary to solve complex problems. I get that now, he said. But I also think there was value in questioning some of the assumptions built into the legacy system. Not all of that complexity was necessary. He had a point. My defensive stance during the Phoenix development hadn't allowed much room for legitimate improvements. You're right. The ideal approach is somewhere in the middle, respecting the knowledge embedded in legacy systems while still looking for opportunities to simplify and improve. Brandon nodded. That's what I'm trying to focus on now. Understanding the why behind everything before suggesting changes. As the elevator arrived, I had a thought. You know, Ghost Ops is growing. We could use someone who's learned these lessons the hard way. Brandon looked surprised. You'd hire me? After everything that happened? Not as a developer or architect, I clarified. But as a cautionary tale, there might be value in that. Think about it. He laughed. I will. Seriously. As I drove home that evening, I reflected on how much had changed in the past 6 months. Phoenix had stabilized and was now processing transactions correctly for all of Finnavar's clients. Ghost Ops Consulting had grown from a one-woman operation to a team of 5. All of us veterans of legacy systems who understood their value. Brandon had learned humility and the importance of understanding before changing. And I had found a new purpose. Not just building systems, but preserving and translating the knowledge they contained, helping companies navigate the delicate balance between respecting their technological heritage and embracing necessary evolution. My phone rang. It was Amy from the Phoenix team. Helen, got a minute? We're seeing some weird behavior in the Israeli date formatter. Only affects a handful of transactions. But I wanted to get your input before we make any changes. Smart move, I said. Let me pull over and take a look. As I parked and opened my laptop, I felt a familiar sense of satisfaction. This was the new normal at Finnvara. Thoughtful consideration before changes. Recognition of the value in those weird edge cases. And a healthy respect for the knowledge embedded in the code. It wasn't perfect. No system ever is. But it was a step in the right direction, away from the worship of newness for its own sake, and toward a more balanced approach that valued both innovation and experience. The Israeli date formatter issue turned out to be a minor one, easily fixed once Amy understood the business reason behind its unusual behavior. As we wrapped up the call, she said something that stuck with me. You know, before all this happened, I used to look at legacy code and just see a mess that needed cleaning up. Now I see stories, all the problems that were solved, the lessons that were learned. It's like archaeology. But for code. Code archaeology, I repeated. I like that. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I got an email from Frank Wells. The subject line was simply, "Thank you." The body of the email was brief. Helen, just wanted to let you know that we closed the Nakamura deal today, our biggest Japanese client yet. Their CTO specifically mentioned that our handling of their unique financial requirements was what set us apart from the competition. None of this would have been possible without you. Not just the crisis management, but the years of building systems that truly understood our clients' needs. Brandon is learning. The team is learning. I'm learning too. Thank you for everything. Frank? I smiled as I set my alarm for 5:17 a.m. Some habits never change, and that's not always a bad thing. Legacy isn't just old code, it's the accumulation of knowledge, experience, and hard-won insights. It's survival logic dressed in scars, and those scars tell important stories for those willing to listen. The tech industry continues its love affair with the new and shiny, discarding the old without understanding its value. But some of us know better. We're the keepers of institutional knowledge, the the translators between generations of technology, the preservers of lessons learned the hard way. We're code archaeologists, uncovering the stories buried in complex systems and ensuring those stories aren't forgotten. It's not glamorous work, but it's vital. And as Finovara discovered, it can be the difference between success and catastrophic failure. As I drifted off to sleep, I thought about all the other companies out there on the verge of making the same mistake, discarding valuable knowledge in the pursuit of technological fashion. GoStops couldn't save them all, but we could save some. And maybe, one case study at a time, we could help shift the industry toward a more balanced perspective. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new systems to understand, new knowledge to preserve. I was ready. After all, legacy code doesn't maintain itself. 6 months turned into a year, and GoStops Consulting continued to grow. We moved from my home office to a small space in downtown Chicago. Adding more consultants as demand increased, our client list expanded beyond financial services to include healthcare, logistics, and government agencies, all organizations with critical legacy systems that contained irreplaceable institutional knowledge. On the anniversary of my departure from Finovara, Frank invited me to lunch. We met at a quiet restaurant overlooking the Chicago River, the autumn sun glinting off the water. I wanted to mark the occasion, he said as we settled at our table. 1 year since the biggest mistake and the biggest learning opportunity of my career. I smiled. How diplomatic of you. I mean it, Frank insisted. What happened with Phoenix was painful, expensive, and embarrassing. But it changed how we think about technology at Finovara. We're better for it. And how's Brandon doing? I asked. Frank's expression softened. He's actually doing well. The special product liaison role started as a punishment, but he's turned it into something valuable. He's become our bridge between the technical teams and the clients, making sure we truly understand their needs before making changes. So he found his place after all. He did. And he still talks about your offer, you know. I raised an eyebrow. My offer? To join GoStops as a cautionary tale. He thought you were joking, but part of him was intrigued. I laughed. I was only half joking. There's value in someone who's seen both sides, the allure of the clean slate and the reality of what gets lost. Frank nodded thoughtfully. That's essentially what he's doing for us now, making sure we don't forget those lessons. Our conversation drifted to other topics. Finovara's growth, GoStops' expanding client base, the changing attitudes in the tech industry toward legacy systems. As we finished our meal, Frank became more serious. There's another reason I wanted to meet today, he said. I've been approached about acquiring Finovara. I set down my coffee cup. Big player or startup? Megacorp, global financial services provider looking to expand their fintech portfolio. And you're considering it? Frank sighed. The offer's very generous. But I'm concerned about what would happen to our systems, our approach. They have their own technology stack, their own way of doing things. I don't want to see everything we've learned get discarded in another corporate consolidation. I understood his concern. Corporate acquisitions often led to exactly the kind of wholesale system replacement that had caused the Phoenix disaster. Have you discussed this with them? Asked about their integration plans? In general terms, they've made the usual promises about respecting our technology and thoughtful integration. But I've been around long enough to know how these things typically go. An idea began to form in my mind. What if GoStops conducted a pre-acquisition audit? We could document all the critical business logic, the special cases, the institutional knowledge embedded in your systems. Create a guide that would make it impossible for them to ignore what's important. Frank's eyes lit up. Could you do that? Create some kind of knowledge map of our systems? We've never done it at that scale before, but yes, I think we could. It would be a significant project, but it would give you leverage in the acquisition negotiations. They couldn't claim they didn't understand what they were getting. By the time we left the restaurant, we had the outline of a plan. GoStops would spend the next month creating a comprehensive knowledge map of Finovara's systems, documenting not just how they worked, but why they worked that way. Frank would use this document in his negotiations with the potential acquirer, making it a condition of the deal that the knowledge map would be respected in any future system integrations. The knowledge mapping project was unlike anything Ghost Ops had done before. We assembled a team of our best consultants, including 2 new hires with experience in financial systems similar to Finovara's. We developed a methodology for identifying and documenting the critical business logic, the special cases, and the institutional knowledge embedded in the code. Brandon, in his role as Special Product Liaison, became our primary contact at Finovara. He arranged interviews with longtime employees, dug up old documentation, and helped us trace the history of key system components. His enthusiasm for the project was genuine. This was a chance to complete the education he should have undertaken before launching Phoenix. As we worked, I was struck by how much knowledge existed only in the minds of Finovara's veteran employees. Even with my years at the company, there were aspects of the systems I'd never fully understood. The Israeli date formatter, for instance, had been implemented before my time. Through our interviews, we discovered it had been created in response to a specific client request that had never been formally documented. One afternoon, as Brandon and I were reviewing our findings on the Brazilian tax calculations, he shook his head in amazement. "You know what kills me? All of this information was here the whole time. If I'd just asked the right questions, talked to the right people, Phoenix might have succeeded from the beginning." "That's the hardest lesson in software development," I replied. "Code isn't just code, it's knowledge given structure. And some of that knowledge isn't written down anywhere except in the code itself. And in people's heads," Brandon added. "Like that time you explained why we needed dual rate processing for UAE transactions. That wasn't documented anywhere, but you knew it because you'd lived through the problem." I nodded. That's why experienced developers are so valuable. Even if they don't know the latest frameworks or programming languages, they carry the history, the context, the why behind the what. By the end of the month, we had produced a 200-page knowledge map of Finovara's systems. It wasn't comprehensive. No document could capture every nuance of systems that had evolved over 15 years, but it highlighted the critical components, the business logic that couldn't be lost in any future integration. Frank was delighted. "This is exactly what I needed," he said after reviewing the document. "Now I can make preserving this knowledge a condition of the acquisition." The acquisition negotiations continued for several more months. I wasn't directly involved, but Frank kept me updated. The knowledge map had indeed become a central point of discussion, with the potential acquirer initially dismissing it as unnecessary, but gradually coming to recognize its value as Frank stood firm. Eventually, a deal was reached that included specific provisions for respecting the business logic documented in the knowledge map during any system integration. Frank would stay on for a transition period of at least a year, and key technical staff, including the Phoenix team, would be retained. The day the acquisition was announced, Frank called me. "It's done, and they've agreed to contract Ghost Ops for the integration oversight." "Congratulations," I said sincerely. "You protected both your company's value and its knowledge." "I learned from the best," he replied. "Or rather, from the worst mistake I almost made. If we hadn't gone through the Phoenix disaster, I might have just taken the money and walked away, leaving them to figure it out." After the call, I sat in my office at Ghost Ops, looking out at the Chicago skyline. What had started as a crisis response to a botched system replacement had evolved into something much more significant. We weren't just fixing technical problems. We were changing how companies thought about their technological heritage. The industry's pendulum was swinging, slowly but surely, away from the wholesale replacement of legacy systems and toward a more nuanced approach that valued the knowledge embedded in those systems. It wasn't just happening at Finovara. We were seeing it across our client base. More thoughtful modernization efforts, more respect for institutional knowledge, more recognition that not all complexity is bad. That evening, as I was preparing to leave the office, my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize. "Helen Briggs," I answered. "Ms. Briggs, my name is Sarah Chen. I'm the CTO at Fincor Systems." Fincor was the company acquiring Finovara. I've been reviewing the knowledge map your team created for Finovara's systems, and I'm impressed. Thank you, I said, curious about where this was going. Frank Wells insisted this document be part of the acquisition agreement, and I'll admit, I was skeptical at first. But having read it, I see its value. In fact, I'm wondering if Ghost Ops could create something similar for our legacy systems. I smiled to myself. The pendulum was indeed swinging. We'd be happy to discuss that. Chen. Our mission at Ghost Ops is to help companies preserve the valuable knowledge embedded in their systems while still evolving their technology. That's exactly what we need, she replied. We've made our share of mistakes with system replacements in the past. I'd like to avoid making them again. As I drove home that evening, I thought about how far we'd come in just 1 year. From the chaos of the Phoenix launch to changing how major financial institutions thought about their technology, it was more than I could have imagined when I was packing up my desk at Finovara. My phone buzzed with a text from Brandon. Heard the news. Looks like we'll be working together again on the integration. I smiled. Looking forward to it. Just remember, no calling good code cute. Never again, he replied. Legacy isn't old code. It's survival logic dressed in scars. I've got that tattooed on my brain now. As I pulled into my driveway, I felt a deep satisfaction. The tech industry would always be enamored with the new and shiny, always tempted to discard the old without understanding its value. But now there were more voices advocating for a balanced approach, more recognition that institutional knowledge was worth preserving. Ghost Ops was growing, spreading this philosophy from company to company. And maybe, in our own small way, we were helping to shift the industry toward a healthier relationship with its past, not dismissing legacy as a burden, but recognizing it as a foundation to build upon. I set my alarm for 5:17 a.m. and smiled. Some habits never change. And sometimes, that's exactly as it should be. Legacy isn't old code, it's survival logic dressed in scars.